Let's just take a second and go back to March 2020. Do you remember that feeling? The world just stopped. And for education, everything was thrown into absolute chaos. One day you're in a classroom. The next, you're scrambling to figure out how to learn and teach from your kitchen table.
And just how big was that scramble? Well, this number says it all. 65%. That's how many post-secondary students in the US had their education completely turned upside down. This wasn't some small adjustment. It was a seismic shift that hit millions of people all at once.
And this was so much more than a logistics problem. The crisis hit students hard. As one professor put it, students were dealing with depression, anxiety, hopelessness, you name it. The move online didn't just change where people learned, it triggered a massive mental and emotional health crisis for an entire generation of students.
And that gets right to the heart of it, doesn't it? The real challenge wasn't just about uploading lectures or figuring out Zoom. The much deeper question was, how do you actually teach a whole person? Their mind, their heart, their spirit, when you're stuck on opposite sides of a screen during a global disaster?
To find an answer, some educators looked back, way back, to an old idea that suddenly felt more relevant than ever, cura personalis. It's a Latin phrase, comes from the Jesuit tradition, and it basically means care for the whole person. It's the core of what's called formative education, which is all about developing a student's entire being, not just stuffing their head with facts.
So what does that actually look like? Well, you can think of formative education as standing on three main pillars. First, there's holistic development, taking care of the mind, heart, and spirit. Second is discovering purpose, helping students see how what they're learning fits into the bigger picture of their lives. And third, and this is crucial, it's all about learning in community. This idea that we don't grow in a vacuum, we grow together.
Okay, so that all sounds great, right? But it raises a huge question. How on earth do you do any of that through a computer screen? How do you build community and help students find purpose when you're all just little boxes in a video call?
This is where things get really interesting. To find out what actually works, researchers went and studied 37 college professors who were absolutely nailing it. These were teachers from every field you can imagine: STEM, the humanities, law, business, all nominated because they had somehow, against all odds, made that transition work beautifully. And what they found was this incredibly powerful three-part framework that all of these amazing educators were using, whether they knew it or not. They called it the empathic approach, the reflective approach, and the adaptive approach. So let's break down what each of those really means.
First up, the empathic approach. This was all about putting students' messy, complicated, very real emotions front and center. It was about remembering that they weren't just a username in a class list, they were a whole person going through something tough.
And this wasn't just a vague feeling. It was about taking specific actions. These professors were constantly reaching out, not just about homework, but to ask, hey, how are you doing? They modeled vulnerability, sharing their own struggles with the pandemic. And they used tools like breakout rooms, not just for projects, but for real human connection. This quote from a professor named Lisa just nails it. She said, if you want your students to bring their whole selves, you can also bring more of your whole self into what you're doing. By admitting she was also stressed, she gave students permission to be human too. It built this incredible foundation of trust. Okay, so on top of that empathy, the second pillar was the reflective approach. This is all about making a direct line between what's happening in the course and what's happening in students' chaotic, real lives.
How did they do it? With things like creative assignments using poetry or journals to help students process everything they were feeling. And they didn't shy away from the real world. They directly connected the class material to the pandemic and to the major social justice movements that were happening. The classroom became a tool to understand the world, not an escape from it.
And there's this one story from the study that just, wow, it stops you in your tracks. A professor had students write a poem about what they saw from their window. One student in Manhattan wrote about seeing ambulances constantly racing by and some of the refrigerator trucks going by. That wasn't just an assignment. That was a lifeline, a way to process something truly unimaginable.
And that brings us to the third and final strategy, the adaptive approach. This is basically where professors threw the old, rigid syllabus out the window and focused on one thing: bending the course to meet students wherever they were.
This meant being radically flexible. They tore up the syllabus and changed it on the fly. And here's the key. They actually asked students, what do you need? How can we make this class better for you, right now? They weren't just broadcasting information. They were building the learning experience with their students.
You can just feel the massive shift in mindset in this quote from a professor named Maxine. She said, "I'm normally kind of a stickler when it comes to deadlines, but all that went out the window. The priority was no longer the rules, it was the people."
So when you put these three approaches together, you see it's not just a tweak to how we teach, it's a whole different philosophy. Traditional teaching is often about transmitting information, sticking to the plan. This formative model is about fostering development in a whole person and adapting to their reality. It's a completely different game. And here's the biggest takeaway of all. These lessons, this entire framework, it isn't just for a crisis. The pandemic didn't invent student struggles. It just put a giant magnifying glass on the challenges that were already there.
Because let's be real, students are still dealing with financial stress, with mental health challenges, with social injustice. Those things didn't magically vanish when people went back to campus. They're the invisible backpack every single student carries into the classroom.
Which leaves us with a really powerful question to think about. The pandemic forced this massive, painful, global experiment on us all. But in doing so, it showed us a more humane, more effective way to teach. So the question is, what if we didn't forget that lesson? What if every class from here on out was designed to teach the whole person? What would change then?